let time go lightly when I'm here with you. I let time go lightly when the day is through. I keep a watch on time when I've got work to do. But I let time go lightly with you. A time for breaking ground and sowing seed.
So that's what struck me is all the things they witnessed. Let's go back. Let's you and I go back to between 1901 and 1931 when the DUR come up through here. Let's say one of these license plates on a car sitting out in front of the hotel, and it's a nice summer's day like today, and you've just been into Grondin and DeLauder's store. I don't know what you were in there for. Maybe you bought some chewing tobacco. I don't know. And I've been in Delano's Hardware, which is the south side of Thompson Hardware today, and we both come out and we meet on the street and we shake hands and we're passing the time of day, and we look over our left shoulder and we look to the end of South Street and we can see the depot just across Mill Street. And there's people milling around up there, and there's a woman with a small child by the hand. We talk a little more, and suddenly from the south, we can hear a rumbling sound. And it gets louder and louder and louder. And suddenly, bursting out into the middle of Mill Street, between where Sherman Well Funeral Home is today and Dr. Reggiani's office, comes this streetcar, clackety-bang, right up the middle, right up past us, right up the middle of South Street, and it stops at Mill Street and then just eases across to the station. And we look over our shoulder and people are scurrying around. They're on a schedule and people are getting off the train, people getting on, unloading freight, putting freight on, and then it eases out of town.
Welcome to Conversations with History. We're talking with Mr. Howard Grovesteen, a longtime Ortonville resident. Your host, Greg Norman. We're going to talk about a number of subjects, Mr. Grovesteen, but you've seen this town grow and you've seen most of what's happened here.
Mm-hmm.
When you were a kid, do you think, is it the same? Is it bigger? What's your thoughts?
Well, of course, so far as population, it's changed a great deal. That's probably the biggest thing I noticed. Years ago, I could drive out Hummer Lake Road, for instance, out to Sashabaw, and there would be 5 or 6 houses out there, and I knew everybody. You know, Brown's Orchard was out there, and the Beckman boys, and Carl and Earl Beckman, and the Fosts, and I knew everybody by their first name. I used to walk in a restaurant, and I knew everybody in the restaurant. Today, I go in, I don't know anybody because of the population explosion. The town itself hasn't changed too much. Couldn't change too much because, you know, there was not too much room to add to it, really. With the boundaries, you'd have to extend the boundaries to really change it a lot. But, of course, you get out on M15, the outlying areas, there's a lot of businesses, and, yeah, that's all. I've always lived at Ortonville.
Your whole life?
Let me answer that specifically.
Okay.
About many years ago, a reporter from the Pontiac Press come out and interviewed an old gentleman in Ortonville by the name of Jerome Huff. And when she wrote her article, she said the first thing she said to Jerome was, "Have you lived in Ortonville all your life, Mr. Huff?" And he said, "Not yet."
Point out we're at the Brandon Senior Center, and there's some noise in the background where they're dumping some rocks in what is the Ortonville DPW yard, which in fact used to be where the Ortonville High School used to be.
That's where I graduated from.
You're one of the Ortonville, and everybody tells all the folks that went to that school, they make sure it's very clear. It wasn't Brandon.
That's right.
It was Ortonville High School.
OHS. That's right.
They're very parochial about their Ortonville High School.
But just think how old you feel when the school you went to is gone.
How many of you graduated class?
27, I think.
Okay.
27. Next year will be our 60th anniversary.
Wow. It can't be, how big a class reunion can you have?
Well, we're talking about it. Excuse me. Last Wednesday, the class 43, I graduated in 44, the class of 43 had their reunion last Wednesday here in town. My wife's sister was in that class, and they come over from Grand Rapids. And I think this is funny. We had a wonderful teacher by the name of Varl Wilkinson. He and his wife met here and married, and I'm sure they have fond memories of Ortonville. He's 88 today. And they had a class reunion, and most of his students were darn near 80 years old.
So he was obviously a relatively new teacher in those days.
Oh, yeah. See, he was only 6, 8, 10 years older than his students,
Sure.
you know.
That's a funny story. Funny story. Now, we're specifically going to talk today a little bit about two things. Your involvement in antique license plates, and more importantly, the Detroit Urban Railroad line, which came right through town. And
Yes.
You've done a bunch of research on that.
Yes.
And what we're trying to do with this Histories in Conversation is to be specific, and so we can talk about those things. And I guess to start with, I saw a picture of you in the local paper with a bunch of license plates. It looks like you've got just a ton of them.
I do. My father-in-law had a bunch of old license plates. He died in 1950. And like many people back then, when you got a different plate every year, he'd nail the old one up on the inside of the garage, you know. And the first 5 years, they come out in 1910, and the first 5 years are porcelain. I've got one here I can show you.
Can we see it?
Sure.
Porcelain is in a dish.
Well, porcelain like in glass over
Right.
steel. They were heavy.
Oh my gosh.
And well, let's get them out here. There's a 14.
It almost feels like metal.
It is metal. It's heavy metal core, and this is glass-like, so they were very fragile, and a lot of them are damaged.
What were they thinking when they made them in this material?
I don't know.
Does that seem reasonable to you that you'd make that like
but
that?
you got one front and rear,
Right.
and they cost $2.
The government's glad to get the money then, too.
Now we'll see what you get, a little piece of paper now. Isn't that something?
That's amazing.
Now that particular plate, did you talk to Kathleen Lease?
Yes, I did.
Okay. That belonged to John Lease, Kathleen's father-in-law. And that's what I take pride in. My license plate collection, many of them belong to people here in Ortonville. And my goal, I think, is to donate them to the Historic Society. I think maybe they want them.
It's funny how the seal is the same seal from 1914 it is today.
Yeah.
They haven't changed the seal in
No.
one shape. It's still the two deer.
No.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Well, father-in-law had a 14, and then, of course, he didn't have a 10, 11, 12, 13.
Right.
And he had most of the teens and most of the 20s, but they were rusted, a lot of them. And I had to learn how to strip those things and refinish them and letter them, which I learned to do. And then my goal was to get one for each year, from 10 up to the present day. And I did that eventually through License Plate Association, Collectors Association. I joined that through those fellows that I got acquainted with, and I went to a few auctions. And
is the memorabilia expensive?
these porcelains cost quite a bit, but basically they aren't expensive.
What kind of price on something like that?
Well, a good 14, you might, if you had a matching pair, it might run $300-400.
Wow.
You go to some of these antique places and they'll ask $500 for that plate, but amongst collectors, they're not that much. But a 10, there weren't many made in 1910.
Right.
And a good clean 10 or a pair of 10s, you're going to pay $500-600 for them. But then beyond that, they aren't really very expensive, you know. Maybe my collection might be worth a couple $1,000. It's no big thing.
Well,
But
now you have some other plates. So obviously you went down through. When did they change the metal?
well, the first 5 years were porcelain. Then they went to the regular plate, but the regular plate had a round white metal Michigan seal, like you see here,
Right.
on the plate. It had a Michigan seal right up in here. The next 5 years.
Okay.
Then they went to the plate as kind of like we know it today. You know, here's a 28.
Yeah, see, you couldn't tell the difference between, and they were obviously getting bigger as time went on, too.
They were bigger. Some of them now, the 24, 25, 26 was this long, Greg. They were huge. And some of them prior to that, 20, 21, 22, were only about this long and about 4 or 5 inches high. But they kind of made them uniform. It's kind of funny. The early years, they went strictly by number. I had a 1930 plate on there. It was only that long and had 4 digits. But then when they went beyond that 4 digits, then they lengthened the plate. So I got another one that had about 7 digits. Well, it started with 1,000,000 and so on. So the more they sold, the longer the plate was.
Wow. If they'd had a good year, they'd stuck it on the side of the car.
Yeah, right.
So that now,
This plate here I refinished, and that belonged to Dr. Uloff, the old doctor here in town, and they had an estate sale here a short time ago.
do you have any idea what I know in the beginning you obviously had numbers, but then they eventually went to letters, and now it's a combination. And sometimes it would denote county, it would denote some of those.
Yes, it denoted county, I know.
Any idea what any of those numbers mean?
No, I don't really.
That's those in incredible shape.
But that's one I stripped down to bare metal and refinished.
Those are terrific.
Yeah.
So you've got all these plates, and obviously they...
Well, you know, the astounding thing is this. The plates themselves aren't as important as the thoughts that come to my mind when I finally, I mounted them on boards. I've got 5 boards, and there's about 15 to 20 plates per board. They go from the start, 10, up to the present day. And I sat down in my basement, and I looked at those plates, and I thought to myself, boy, if those old plates could only talk. Some of the things they witnessed. They could have belonged to the proud owner of a new automobile built in downtown Ortonville. And that new automobile could have been a Willys Knight. It could have been a Whippet, which was a downsized Willys Knight. It could have been a Chevrolet. It could have been a Ford. It could have been an Oakland. It could have been a Pontiac. All purchased in downtown Ortonville.
And in the surrounding areas, the Rochester Car Company actually built cars in 1907 to about 1920.
Yeah.
So you could have actually bought a car, from the local area. Not that.
Yeah.
So it was,
These plates could have been on a car having its tank filled with gas in downtown Ortonville. My earliest recollection was we had a Sinclair station downtown. We had a Fleetwing station. Fleetwing.
Explain what that is, because I don't know what that is.
Well, I can still see their sign. It's a bird with big long wings on it, and the name was Fleetwing. That was the name of the gas.
Okay.
And there was one pump at the corner of Church and Mill Street there where the pool room was.
Gas was probably, as Kathleen Lease was mentioning about that time, when gas was probably in the 17, 18 cents a gallon.
Probably. And then down in front of the Chevrolet garage, they had a mobile station. And then out on M15 here, they had a Sunoco and a Shell. And down at Bald Eagle Lake, they had a Gulf and a Texaco. My earliest collections. There have been a lot of different ones since then, but that's my earliest collection.
Wow. It's just amazing to me to watch the different colors too. And now we've gone to you get the little tabs and those kind of things. The license plates. Now when you started collecting in later years, obviously you only collect one license plate now because in those days you had to have it front and back.
Yeah.
Nobody now has a front license plate unless it's decorative.
Right.
Something
right.
because it's not required.
Yeah.
From that standpoint. I wonder if size, when they decided this too, that they also had to figure out that you have to be able to see it from a ways. So from a standpoint, because obviously these numbers are exactly the same size as the ones are now.
Yeah.
They're 4-inch numbers.
Yeah. But look how difficult it must be to see this little tab to see whether you have a legal plate on your car. Yeah. How do the police do that? I don't know.
Good eyesight. Good eyesight.
Yeah.
This is the only mode of transportation in town. And to that thought, we should mention that the DUR is the Detroit Urban Railroad.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about that for the next segment.
Yeah.
We'll be back in just a second.
Okay.
Now we'll start again. Just keep it running. 5. Say your last name again.
Grovesteen.
Grovesteen.
Should have been Smith, but I didn't have anything to say about it.
5, 4. We're talking 5, 4. We're back talking with Howard Grovesteen. We're talking about the Detroit Urban Railroad, and you just painted a terrific picture about downtown, but you said something interesting. Before we talk about the Detroit Urban Railroad, you'd mentioned the word milling around the train depot. Mm-hmm. Now they call it loitering. So talking about times have changed. The adjectives have also changed at those times.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the Detroit Urban Railroad and it's what it meant to the community, and I know you've got a little bit of history with it, and you know quite a bit about it. Tell us what you know.
Well, before that, let's talk a little bit about the horse and buggy.
Okay.
I drove around Ortonville the other day and looked, and there's at least 8 or 10 hay burner garages still in the village of Ortonville. It's barns.
Explain to me.
Barns.
Hay burner's a barn.
Barn. Well, a hay burner was a horse.
Oh, okay. That's right. I'm sorry.
Barn, excuse me. But barns that still exist where people housed their transportation, horse and buggy. And if you wanted to go to Flint, say, you had to get up in the dark and come home in the dark. I mean, it was a long trip, you know.
Sure.
Especially, well, if you had a frisky horse with a buggy, you could make better time, but it took a long time. The point is, it took a long time. Now the DUR comes along here, and you can get on that DUR, and you're in Flint within the hour. Now, what kind of a shock was that to the system for a person who had always been transported by a horse and buggy and their parents and their grandparents before them? So that was quite a step. I mean, my father rode that, and he said that thing went 60 miles an hour.
Which in those days was incredibly fast.
Sure. Now, the automobile was in the background, was coming along. But the automobile, and they would soon be able to travel at a good rate of speed, but the roads wouldn't allow them to. So, the roads there, the M15, for instance, was a hog wall.
Well, I think the interesting point is that we talk now about mass transit within the 3 or 4 county area.
Mm-hmm.
We had mass transit in the beginning.
Yes.
And one of the things about Detroit, when Detroit was designed, including what was the urban areas and the suburban areas,
Mm-hmm.
in this case the farm country,
Mm-hmm.
was it was designed so that the epicenter was downtown, but as everything moved out, they still provided for transportation.
Mm-hmm.
That's why you had Gratiot. That's why you had some of the Dixie
Mm-hmm.
Highway for us out here
Mm-hmm.
was the way you came out of town.
Yeah.
Those were the straight roads because it was fanned, if you will,
Yeah.
in terms of the design. And so when they built the railroad, which I understand it went away about the middle 1940s?
The interurban that come up through here,
Yeah.
it run from 1901 to 1931. It went out of business in April 31.
And that was the advent of the car, I would assume.
Yeah, the car, finally, when the car first come out, people thought it was a flash in the pan. It wasn't going to last. And finally, when they made up their mind, and they were making thousands more cars each year, they made up their mind that the car was here to stay. Then the municipalities and the counties and the state got busy and started building hard surface roads. And as they did that, the car took over and finally put the interurban out of business in 1931 here. And it wasn't it varied some down in southeast Michigan, but eventually it wasn't too long and they were all out. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have it today?
Especially if it were cheap transportation.
Yeah.
What would it cost to ride the urban railroad in those days?
I don't know. I don't remember in the book what they said it was. I don't know.
Now, were they just regular train cars?
Yeah, they were electricity powered them, and they had the power plant out here. The main power plant was in Rochester, and then they had kind of like a booster station in Oxford and in Atlas out this way. And
this was not a steam or a coal. This was
a
just a
streetcar,
really
right?
What it was a streetcar.
Right, it was a streetcar. That's right.
Which is a different concept than when we think about. We think of
Right.
the railroad as being
Yeah,
something a little
right.
bit more majestic.
Yeah, streetcar.
So
They were dangerous. I understand, just rumor I've heard that they were dangerous because they didn't have the proper warnings on these crossroads and so on. And, people could come out and I've got a picture in here of a ticket, and each road that come out to the rails between here and Goodrich, for instance, people could walk out from the farm out to the railroad and they'd pick them up. And the county line road up here where I was born, the first farm north of that is the old Patterson farm, and on the ticket that says Patterson there. And the next one is Horton Road, and they call that Sunnyside. Those people could all walk out and get on and off, and I suppose they designated those stops so that you paid a different price depending on, the distance and so on and so forth.
Have you ever wondered if that streetcar, if you will, would have stayed in existence, how much different northern Oakland County would have changed? There would have been much more commuting. There would probably been more building from that standpoint because there would have been transportation. You wonder if maybe the farm would have gone by the wayside faster because transportation had obviously a great impact on the way communities developed.
Yeah. Well, automobiles kind of did the same thing to us,
Yeah.
The automobile really took over, and there's a lot to be said about that. I sold cars for Lynn Owen starting in 1951 when I was 24 years old. And there's a lot to be said about that. I mean, there's a world of difference between the automobile back in 51 when I started selling them, and then there is today. They're engineered so much better today than them old cars. There's no comparison.
Yeah.
Well, I'm getting off the track. I'm getting off the track.
No. What I'm saying is if we would have not had, I mean, when you were a child, to go to the city was an all-day affair. To leave the farm or to leave the
well, it was before my time. Horse and buggy was before my time. We had the automobile, you know.
No, I understand it, but I'm saying
but
nowadays the kids just go to the mall.
Yeah.
If you were going to go shopping in Flint, it was kind of a, even when you were a teenager, it was kind of an all-day trip.
Oh yeah.
So the stores were geared differently than they were ours. So transportation played a great way in the way the community developed.
Well, I guess probably you depended more on your small town too to get your groceries and your supplies, because it took too long to go to Flint or Pontiac.
And you spent a good portion of your life selling cars?
16 years.
16 years?
Yeah, and I was a State Farm agent for 25.
How is selling cars now? You obviously buy them. How is selling cars any different today than it was then?
Well, it was, the car itself, there's a lot of difference. When I started working for Lynn Owen, I was 24 years old. I was just a kid. And after World War II, there was more demand than there was supply of cars, and of course the dealers just took a list of names, Well, finally about 1951 they started to catch up a little bit. So Lynn Owen come to me and asked me if I would sell cars for him, first salesman. And Lynn went to a printer and got a personal card made up for me, and it said L. Owen Chevrolet Sales, 53 South Street, Ortonville, phone number, and it said Howard Grovesteen, and underneath my name it said sales manager. Here's a kid 24 years old. He's a sales manager in a car dealership.
That's pretty impressive.
Well, that's pretty impressive. Now let's kind of elaborate on that a little. Somebody buys a car. We'll make it short. Somebody buys a car from me. Come in, they see a car they like, we agree on price. So the sales manager takes him into the office, and we write up a bill of sale with the serial number, and we list the price of the car. And in those days, you bought the accessories separate. Right. So we have a little quiz game. We want this, and so on. So the sales manager gets all the paperwork together, and the man says, when can I get my car? This is a Monday, say. And I'd say, well, I have to go over and talk to the serviceman, and went over there, see how much work he had ahead, and he said, tell him Thursday. Okay, go back, tell the man Thursday. Okay, so he leaves. Now, the sales manager, quote unquote, becomes the secretary. So I get an RD 108 out, and I get a title application and a registration form, and if he's financing, I get a State Bank of Ortonville contract or a GMAC contract. Now I'm the secretary, and I get my paperwork all done, and I clip it together, and I'm all set for him. And Monroe Frick, who was a service manager, Monroe comes over about Wednesday, and he says, that car's ready. We're all done. We've got all the accessories on it. I said, okay. So I put my shop coat on, and now the sales manager becomes a cleanup boy. And I wash it and polish it and get the grease off the seats and the inside if there is any, and check it all over and clean it up. And the man comes and gets his car, and he leaves, and I see the floor is kind of dirty and messed up, and so the sales manager becomes the janitor. So I just wanted to put that sales manager thing in perspective. That was different.
Well, our cameraman today, Jason Dubois, works at Sims locally and washes cars and does some things, so he'll appreciate that story, knowing how much you had to do as a sales manager that they don't have to do today. The question I have to ask you, though, is there's an impression that automobile salesmen are a little slick sometimes. It wasn't quite that slick in those days, or was it? Has it changed?
No.
Because you only had.
I would say that, wouldn't I?
Well,
a small town. Listen,
in a small town, you had a lot of repeat business.
You had a lot of repeat business. Let me tell you something. In a small town, everybody knew everybody, and you didn't have any choice. I mean,
customer service was built in.
Joe Blow up the road, he comes and turns his car into you, and he wants to get as much for that old car as he can get, and he'll tell you what a wonderful car that is. But he's told his neighbor that transmission's about ready to go out of that thing. So this neighbor comes in to buy the car, and he says, is there anything wrong with that car? And I say, go up and ask Joe Blow. It belonged to him.
You can say the truth or not.
That's right.
Well, a salesman, or in this case, sales manager, would find himself. I mean, our family bought the same group of cars from a Holly dealership for 25 years.
You're right.
Well, they were selling 4, 5, 6 cars a year to the family.
Yeah.
The last thing they would do, speak up over the truck. The last thing they would do would be doing something stupid by not taking care of customer service.
Yeah.
Well, now there's a dealer almost on every corner.
Yeah.
And it's maybe a little bit different from that standpoint.
Yeah.
As I'm sure even from and I don't want to digress, but even the insurance business that you were obviously in has changed a lot.
Well, in a small community, it's so personal. I mean, you know everybody, and I think people trust, they know you. I mean, they go to church with you, and they went to school with you, and you know these people, and there's a personal thing there. I used to, when things were slow around the garage, I used to jump my car and I'd go out in the country and see Joe Blow the farmer, The farmers had money when nobody else did, and they'd buy automobiles. Or I'd go up to Goodrich and go in the garage up there and mingle and see people, And I actually go out and see people about buying a car. Let me ask you this. How many car salesmen have ever knocked on your door to sell you an automobile?
Never.
Never. I knew what you was going to say before you said it. I've had people say to me today, you used to come out and see me. And that's just the way things were. That was a, I don't know.
You and doctors would make house calls.
Right.
That doesn't happen anymore.
Right. So when I started the insurance business, State Farm said, you go out and knock on doors. I did. I went out and knocked on doors, but when they come to the door, I call them by their first name. So I was able to be successful there. I mean, you just knew.
I guess just a point for me, not so much for the interview, but I'm curious, when somebody makes a choice to stay in a community they grew up in, it's a very conscious choice. And obviously you've spent your whole life here.
Yeah.
Do you remember a point why, I'm not that it matters, I'm just curious, why Ortonville and why your whole life here?
You'll have to ask the Lord that. When you retire and you're in the twilight of your years, you think of all the things you have accomplished or what you've done. And when you look back over those years, you know that somebody was sitting on your shoulder. And somebody was sitting on my shoulder all the way, and I've been blessed in many ways.
The people here are different. They're very special.
Yeah.
Very special.
Yeah. My mother's parents lived right here on Church Street, and their main social life was to go to the Ortonville Methodist Church. And my grandfather died in ¡58, never owned an automobile, and he worked the only thing he ever did was to work for the farmers, and there was farmers all over the place, and they would come in the spring of the year when they were getting ready to plant, when they were extra busy, or at harvest time. They'd drive in and they'd hire my grandfather, and he worked for $2 a day. That was the going rate. He was a tall man. He was about 6'2", 6'3". That's all he'd ever done was farm. And my grandmother was a little short woman. She wasn't hardly 5 foot. They looked like Mutt and Jeff. And I can see them today getting ready to go to church. They were poor monetarily, but they were rich in every other way. Yeah.
Sam Levinson, the old humorist, used to say, I didn't know I was poor until somebody told me.
That's right. That's exactly right.
It's one of those.
That's right. Their influence and people that went to this church's influence was such that 2 of my mother's brothers become Methodist ministers.
Wow.
One was a missionary in Africa for 25 years. His son, who grew up over there, become a linguist, and Phil Stein traveled the whole world translating the Bible for people to learn about Jesus Christ. So it all emanated from this $2 a day household in this little church, and it affected the lives of people all over the world. There's a real story there.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that over the years, selling and being involved with Allstate, or State Farm, excuse me, I'm sure that there's plenty of stories that come with that and how that's all changed. But providing insurance was something was relatively unique in those days. I would think it was not you take it for granted today, but what do you need car insurance for, kind of thing in those days?
Well, it was that, like everything else, it evolved, and it's altogether different today than it was back then. But I talked to old agents when I started. Well, for instance, I remember one fellow that was a vice president down in Marshall, where our regional office was, started out with State Farm in the claims department. And he and one other fellow handled the claims for the whole state of Michigan. You wrecked your car, you drive out to your house, you know.
That's good service.
Couldn't do it that way today. It'd be impossible, you know.
Well, you know, with talking in this series that we're doing, what's really fun is as I mentioned, you used the word milling, I used the word loitering.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a couple of interviews with folks who were involved with farms in the community.
Uh-huh.
And you were pointing out that the only people that had money were farmers that could buy cars, and the farmers would tell you in this same interview a couple of weeks ago is that they just were barely scraping by. So it's perception is one of the cool parts about this Conversations with History is we're getting a lot of different, you know, variables on what history really was.
Yeah.
And like any other thing, if you know you describe the apple, you'd get 10 people describing it 10 different ways.
Yeah.
But the one thing that keeps coming back is how much people love living here, and how much people love growing up here and staying here, raising their families.
Yeah. Well, farmers weren't rich or anything, but we had a lot of good farmers that made a good living.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is when maybe the shops were slow and the shop workers weren't doing too well, the farmer more or less had a steady income, but the farmer earned his buck the hard way.
Yes, he did.
And he was a tough guy to do business with too, you know. Yeah. And understandably so, you know.
Well, if they had a bad crop, they didn't.
But the point is they were able to buy, you know. They'd twist your arm. But they're good people.
Without digressing, where were you taking your license plate collection now? Where do you go with
I'm
it?
through. I'm through. My goal was just to, you know, I'm not really in the license plate business. I've got a friend in Clio that belongs to this collectors association that has 17,000 license plates.
Where's he keep them?
In his garage.
Wow.
Cases up. He doesn't have a lot of old ones. He don't know how to refinish them. He sent me 35 or 40 1962s last year to refinish for him. But he goes to meets and places and he sells them, and I asked him the other day, I said, how many plates do you take when you go on a weekend to sell some plates? He said, oh, we put about 3,000 in a pickup. But I'm through. I've got maybe 150. My goal was just, and beyond that too, it's the personal relationship. There's plates on there. I've got a pair of 1913 porcelains that are beauties. They're just like new. And they belong to Homer Croup, who was a rural mill carrier here in Ortonville. I've got one on there, one of the blue plates that we still see today that belonged to a friend of mine, Glenn Marsh, who was a prisoner of war. It's a prisoner of war plate. There was a prisoner in Germany.
Wow. And
I've got several, and I'm going to put this one, John Lisa's, on there. And one of Kathleen's, Kathleen gave me some plates, and I've got one for them too. And then if I do give them to the Historic Society, why, I'll make a list of that, or I'll put a tag on them or something and designate that these different plates belong to people in the area.
Mr. Grovesteen, it's been a pleasure talking to you. You're a delight. We appreciate you sharing some views and some thoughts with us, and we thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week.
Okay.
Thank you.